In Defense of Dorian Gray, a collection of letters to the editor made by the author between 1890 and 1891, defending his new novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. To the editor of the St. James Gazette, 25th June, 1890. Sir, I have read your criticism of my story, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and I need hardly say that I do not propose to discuss its merits or demerits, its personalities or its lack of personality. England is a free country, and ordinary English criticism is perfectly free and easy. Besides, I must admit, either from temperament or from taste, or from both, I am quite incapable of understanding how any work of art can be criticized from a moral standpoint. The sphere of art and the sphere of ethics are absolutely distinct and separate, and it is to the confusion between the two that we owe the appearance of Mrs. Grundy, that amusing old lady who represents the only original form of humor that the middle classes of this country have been able to produce. What I do object to most strongly is that you should have placarded the town with posters on which was printed in large letters, "Mr. Oscar Wilde's latest advertisement, a bad case." Whether the expression "a bad case" refers to my book or to the present position of the government, I cannot tell. What was silly and unnecessary was the use of the term advertisement. I think I may say without vanity, though I do not wish to appear to run vanity down, that of all men in England I am the one who requires least advertisement. I am tired to death of being advertised. I feel no thrill when I see my name in a paper. The Chronicle does not interest me any more. I wrote this book entirely for my own pleasure, and it gave me very great pleasure to write it. Whether it becomes popular or not is a matter of absolute indifference to me. I am afraid, sir, that the real advertisement is your cleverly written article. The English public as a mass takes no interest in a work of art until it is told that the work in question is immoral, and your réclame will, I have no doubt, largely increase the sale of the magazine, in which sale I may mention with some regret, I have no pecuniary interest. I remain, sir, your obedient servant, Oscar Wilde. To the editor of the St. James Gazette, 26th June. In your issue of today, you state that my brief letter published in your columns is the quote-unquote best reply I can make to your article upon Dorian Gray. This is not so. I do not propose to fully discuss the matter here, but I feel bound to say that your article contains the most unjustifiable attack that has been made upon any man of letters for many years. The writer of it, who is quite incapable of concealing his personal malice, and so in some measure destroys the effect he wishes to produce, seems to not have the slightest idea of the temper in which a work of art should be approached. To say that such a book as mine should be chucked into the fire is silly. That is what one does with newspapers. Of the value of pseudo-ethical criticism in dealing with artistic work, I have spoken already. But as your writer has ventured into the perilous grounds of literary criticism, I ask you to allow me, in fairness not merely to myself, but to all men to whom literature is a fine art, to say a few words about his critical method. He begins by assailing me with much ridiculous virulence because the chief personages in my story are quote-unquote puppies. They are puppies. Does he think that literature went to the dogs when Thackeray wrote about puppydom? I think that puppies are extremely interesting from an artistic as well as from a psychological point of view. They seem to me to be certainly far more interesting than prigs. And I am of the opinion that Lord Henry Wotton is an excellent corrective of the tedious ideal shadowed forth in the semi-theological novels of our age. He then makes vague and fearful insinuations about my grammar and my erudition. Now, as regards grammar, I hold that, in prose at any rate, correctness should always be subordinate to artistic effect and musical cadence, and any peculiarities of syntax that may occur in Dorian Gray are deliberately intended, and are introduced to show the value of the artistic theory in question. Your writer gives no instance of any such peculiarity. This I regret, because I do not think that any such instances occur. As regards erudition, it is always difficult, even for the most modest of us, to remember that other people do not know quite as much as one does oneself. I myself frankly admit I cannot imagine how a casual reference to Suetonius and Petronius Arbiter can be construed into evidence of a desire to impress an unoffending and ill-educated public by an assumption of superior knowledge. I should fancy that the most ordinary of scholars is perfectly well acquainted with the lives of the Caesars and with the Satyricon. The Lives of the Caesars, at any rate, forms part of the curriculum at Oxford for those who take the honor school of Literae Humaniores. And as for the Satyricon, it is popular even among passmen, though I suppose they are obliged to read it in translations. The writer of the article then suggests that I, in common with that great and noble artist Count Tolstoy, take pleasure in a subject because it is dangerous. About such a suggestion there is this to be said. Romantic art deals with the exception and with the individual. Good people belonging as they do to the normal and so commonplace type are artistically uninteresting. Bad people are, from the point of view of art, fascinating studies. They represent color, variety, and strangeness. Good people exasperate one's reason. Bad people stir one's imagination. Your critic, if I must give him so honorable a title, states that the people in my story have no counterpart in life, that they are, to use his vigorous, if somewhat vulgar phrase, mere catchpenny revelations of the non-existent. Quite so. If they existed, they would not be worth writing about. The function of the artist is to invent, not to chronicle. There are no such people. If there were, I would not write about them. Life, by its realism, is always spoiling the subject matter of art. The supreme pleasure in literature is to realize the non-existent. And finally, let me say this. You have reproduced in a journalistic form the comedy of Much Ado About Nothing, and have, of course, spoilt it in your reproduction. The poor public, hearing from an authority so high as your own that this is a wicked book that should be coerced and suppressed by a Tory government, will no doubt rush to it and read it. But alas, they will find that it is a story with a moral, and the moral is this. All excess, as well as all renunciation, brings its own punishment. The painter Basil Hallward, worshipping physical beauty far too much, as most painters do, dies by the hand of one in whose soul he has created a monstrous and absurd vanity. Dorian Gray, having led a life of mere sensation and pleasure, tries to kill conscience, and at that moment kills himself. Lord Henry Wotton seeks to be merely the spectator of life. He finds that those who reject the battle are more deeply wounded than those who take part in it. Yes, there is a terrible moral in Dorian Gray, a moral which the prurient will not be able to find in it, but which will be revealed to all whose minds are healthy. Is this an artistic error? I fear it is. It is the only error in the book. To the editor of the St. James Gazette, 27th June. Sir, as you still keep up, though in a somewhat milder form than before, your attacks on me and my book, you not merely confer on me the right, but you impose upon me the duty of reply. You state in your issue of today that I misrepresented you when I said that you suggested that a book so wicked as mine should be suppressed and coerced by a Tory government. Now, you did not propose this, but you did suggest it. When you declare that you do not know whether or not the government will take action about my book, and remark that the authors of books much less wicked have been proceeded against in law, the suggestion is quite obvious. In your complaint of misrepresentation, you seem to me, sir, to have been not quite candid. However, as far as I am concerned, the suggestion is of no importance. What is of importance is that the editor of a paper like yours should appear to countenance the monstrous theory that the government of a country should exercise a censorship over imaginative literature. This is a theory against which I, and all men of letters of my acquaintance, protest most strongly. And any critic who admits the reasonableness of such a theory shows at once that he is quite incapable of understanding what literature is, and what are the rights that literature possesses. A government might just as well try to teach painters how to paint, or sculptors how to model, as attempt to interfere with the style, treatment, and subject matter of the literary artist. And no writer, however eminent or obscure, should ever give his sanction to a theory that would degrade literature far more than any didactic or so-called immoral book could possibly do. You then express your surprise that so experienced a literary gentleman as myself should imagine that your critic was animated by any feeling of personal malice towards him. The phrase literary gentleman is a vile phrase, but let that pass. I accept quite readily your assurance that your critic was simply criticizing a work of art in the best way that he could, but I feel that I was fully justified in forming the opinion of him that I did. He opened his article by a gross personal attack on myself. This, I need hardly say, was an absolutely unpardonable error of critical taste. There is no excuse for it, except personal malice, and you, sir, should not have sanctioned it. A critic should be taught to criticize a work of art without making any reference to the personality of the author. This, in fact, is the beginning of criticism. However, it was not merely his personal attack on me that made me imagine that he was actuated by malice. What really confirmed me in my first impression was his reiterated assertion that my book was tedious and dull. Now, if I were criticizing my book, which I have some thoughts of doing, I think I would consider it my duty to point out that it is far too crowded with sensational incident, and far too paradoxical in style, as far at any rate as the dialogue goes. I feel that from a standpoint of art, these are two defects in the book. But tedious and dull the book is not. Your critic has cleared himself of the charge of personal malice, his denial and yours being quite sufficient in the matter. But he has only done so by a tacit admission that he has really no critical instinct about literature and literary work, which, in one who writes about literature, is, I need hardly say, a much graver fault than malice of any kind. Finally, sir, allow me to say this. Such an article as you have published really makes one despair of the possibility of any general culture in England. Were I a French author, and my book brought out in Paris, there is not a single literary critic in France, on any paper of high standing, who would think for a moment of criticizing it from an ethical standpoint. If he did so, he would stultify himself, not merely in the eyes of all men of letters, but in the eyes of the majority of the public. You have yourself often spoken against Puritanism. Believe me, sir, Puritanism is never so offensive and destructive as when it deals with art matters. It is there that its influence is radically wrong. It is this Puritanism, to which your critic has given expression, that is always marring the artistic instinct of the English. So far from encouraging it, you should set yourself against it, and should try to teach your critics to recognize the essential difference between art and life. The gentleman who criticized my book is in a perfectly hopeless confusion about it, and your attempt to help him out by proposing that the subject matter of art should be limited does not mend matters. It is proper that limitations should be placed on action. It is not proper that limitations should be placed on art. To art belongs all things that are, and all things that are not, and even the editor of a London paper has no right to restrain the freedom of art in the selection of subject matter. I now trust, sir, that these attacks on me and on my book will cease. There are forms of advertisement that are unwarranted and unwarrantable. I am, sir, your obedient servant, Oscar Wilde. To Ward, Locke and Company. Gentlemen, kindly do not send out any more copies of Mr. Lippincott's puff of my book. It is really an insult to the critics. Also, will you kindly let me know if I can have an interview with you on Thursday morning at 12 o'clock? Yours truly, Oscar Wilde. To the editor of the St. James Gazette, 28th June. Sir, in your issue of this evening, you publish a letter from a London editor which clearly insinuates in the last paragraph that I have in some way sanctioned the circulation of an expression of opinion on the part of the proprietors of Lippincott's magazine of the literary and artistic value of my story of the Picture of Dorian Gray. Allow me, sir, to state that there are no grounds for this insinuation. I was not aware that any such document was being circulated, and I have written to the agents, Messrs. Ward and Locke, who cannot, I feel sure, be primarily responsible for its appearance, to ask them to withdraw it at once. No publisher should ever express an opinion of the value of what he publishes. That is a matter entirely for the literary critic to decide. I must admit, as one to whom contemporary literature is constantly submitted for criticism, that the only thing that ever prejudices me against a book is the lack of literary style. But I can quite understand how any ordinary critic would be strongly prejudiced against a work that was accompanied by a premature and unnecessary panegyric from the publisher. A publisher is simply a useful middleman. It is not for him to anticipate the verdict of criticism. I may, however, while expressing my thanks to the London editor for drawing my attention to this, I trust purely American method of procedure, venture to differ from him in one of his criticisms. He states that he regards the expression complete as applied to a story as a specimen of the adjectival exuberance of the puffer. Here, it seems to me, he sadly exaggerates. What my story is an interesting problem. What my story is not is a novelette, a term which you have more than once applied to it. There is no such word in the English language as novelette. It should never be used. It is merely part of the slang of Fleet Street. In another part of your paper, sir, you state that I received your assurance of the lack of malice in your critic, somewhat grudgingly. This is not so. I frankly said that I accepted that assurance quite readily, and that your own denial and that of your own critic were sufficient. Nothing more generous could have been said. What I did feel was that you saved your critic from the charge of malice by convicting him of the unpardonable crime of lack of literary instinct. I still feel that. To call my book an ineffective attempt at allegory that in the hands of Mr. Anstey might have been made striking is absurd. Mr. Anstey's sphere in literature and my sphere are different, very widely different. You then gravely ask me what rights I imagine literature possesses. That is really an extraordinary question for the editor of a newspaper such as yours to ask. The rights of literature, sir, are the rights of intellect. I remember once hearing M. Renan say that he would sooner live under a military despotism than under the despotism of the Church, because the former merely limited the freedom of action, while the latter limited the freedom of mind. You say that a work of art is a form of action. It is not. It is the highest mode of thought. In conclusion, sir, let me ask you not to force on me this continued correspondence by daily attacks. It is a trouble and a nuisance. As you assailed me first, I have a right to the last word. Let that last word be the present letter, and leave my book, I beg you, to the immortality that it deserves. I am, sir, your obedient servant, Oscar Wilde. To the editor of the Daily Chronicle, 30th June. Sir, will you allow me to correct some errors into which your critic has fallen in his review of my story, The Picture of Dorian Gray, published in today's issue of your paper? Your critic states, to begin with, that I make desperate attempts to vamp up a moral in my story. Now, I must candidly confess that I do not know what vamping is. I see from time to time mysterious advertisements in the newspapers about how to vamp, but what vamping really means remains a mystery to me, a mystery that, like all other mysteries, I hope someday to explore. However, I do not propose to discuss the absurd terms used by modern journalism. What I want to say is that, so far from wishing to emphasize any moral in my story, the real trouble I experienced in writing this story was that of keeping the extremely obvious moral subordinate to the artistic and dramatic effect. When I first conceived the idea of the young man selling his soul in exchange for eternal youth, an idea that is old in the history of literature, but to which I have given new form, I felt that, from an aesthetic point of view, it would be difficult to keep the moral in its proper secondary place. And even now I do not feel quite sure that I have been able to do so. I think the moral too apparent. When the book is published in a volume, I hope to correct this defect. As for what the moral is, your critic states that it is this, that when a man feels himself becoming too angelic, he should rush out and make a beast of himself. I cannot say that I consider this a moral. The real moral of the story is that all excess, as well as all renunciation, brings its punishment, and this moral is so far artistically and deliberately suppressed that it does not enunciate its law as a general principle, but realizes itself purely in the lives of individuals, and so becomes simply a dramatic element in a work of art, and not the object of the work of art itself. Your critic also falls into error when he says that Dorian Gray, having a, quote, cool, calculating, conscienceless character, end quote, was inconsistent when he destroyed the picture of his own soul, on the ground that the picture did not become less hideous after he had done what, in his vanity, he had considered his first good action. Dorian Gray has not a cool, calculating, conscienceless character at all. On the contrary, he is extremely impulsive, absurdly romantic, and is haunted all through his life by an exaggerated sense of conscience, which mars his pleasures for him, and warns him that youth and enjoyment are not everything in the world. It is finally to get rid of the conscience that had dogged his steps from year to year that he destroys the picture, and thus in his attempt to kill conscience, Dorian Gray kills himself. Your critic then talks about obtrusively cheap scholarship. Now, whatever a scholar writes is sure to display scholarship in the distinction of style and the fine use of language. But my story contains no learned or pseudo-learned discussions, and the only literary books that it alludes to are books that any fairly educated reader may be supposed to be acquainted with, such as the Satyricon of Petronius Arbiter or Gautier's Emo et Camées. Such books as Alfonso's Clericalis Disciplina belong not to culture, but to curiosity. Anybody may be excused for not knowing them. Finally, let me say this. The aesthetic movement produced certain colors, subtle in their loveliness and fascinating in their almost mystical tone. They were, and are, our reaction against the crude primaries of a doubtless more respectable but certainly less cultivated age. My story is an essay on decorative art. It reacts against the crude brutality of plain realism. It is poisonous, if you like, but you cannot deny that it is also perfect, and perfection is what we artists aim at. I remain, sir, your obedient servant, Oscar Wilde. To the editor of the Scots Observer, 9th July. Sir, you have published a review of my story, The Picture of Dorian Gray. As this review is grossly unjust to me as an artist, I ask you to allow me to exercise in your columns my right of reply. Your reviewer, sir, while admitting that the story in question is plainly the work of a man of letters, the work of one who has, quote, brains and art and style, end quote, yet suggest, and apparently in all seriousness, that I have written it in order that I should be read by the most depraved members of the criminal and illiterate classes. Now, sir, I do not suppose that the criminal and illiterate classes ever read anything except newspapers. They are certainly not likely to be able to understand anything of mine. So let them pass, and on the broad question of why a man of letters writes at all, let me say this. The pleasure that one has in creating a work of art is a purely personal pleasure, and it is for the sake of this pleasure that one creates. The artist works with his eye on the object. Nothing else interests him. What people are likely to say does not even occur to him. He is fascinated by what he has in hand. He is indifferent to others. I write because it gives me the greatest possible artistic pleasure to write. If my work pleases the few, I am gratified. If it does not, it causes me no pain. As for the mob, I have no desire to be a popular novelist. It is far too easy. Your critic, then, sir, commits the absolutely unpardonable crime of trying to confuse the artist with his subject matter. For this, sir, there is no excuse at all. Of one who is the greatest figure in the world's literature since Greek days, Keats remarked that he had as much pleasure in conceiving the evil as he had in conceiving the good. Let your reviewer, sir, consider the bearings of Keats's fine criticism, for it is under these conditions that every artist works. One stands remote from one's subject matter. One creates it, and one contemplates it. The further away the subject matter is, the more freely can the artist work. Your reviewer suggests that I do not make it sufficiently clear whether I prefer virtue to wickedness, or wickedness to virtue. An artist, sir, has no ethical sympathies at all. Virtue and wickedness are to him simply what the colors on his palette are to the painter. They are no more and they are no less. He sees that by their means a certain artistic effect can be produced, and he produces it. Iago may be morally horrible, and Imogen stainlessly pure. Shakespeare, as Keats said, had as much delight in creating the one as he had in creating the other. It was necessary, sir, for the dramatic development of this story to surround Dorian Gray with an atmosphere of moral corruption. Otherwise, the story would have had no meaning and the plot no issue. To keep this atmosphere vague and indeterminate and wonderful was the aim of the artist who wrote the story. I claim, sir, that he has succeeded. Each man sees his own sin in Dorian Gray. What Dorian Gray's sins are, no one knows. He who finds them has brought them. In conclusion, sir, let me say how really deeply I regret that you should have permitted such a notice as the one I feel constrained to write on to have appeared in your paper. That the editor of the St. James Gazette should have employed a Caliban as his art critic was possibly natural. The editor of the Scots Observer should not have allowed Thucydides to make mows in his review. It is unworthy of so distinguished a man of letters. I am, etc., Oscar Wilde. To the editor of the Scots Observer, July 1890. Sir, in a letter dealing with the relations of art to morals recently published in your columns, a letter which I may say seems to me in many respects admirable, especially in its insistence on the right of the artist to select his own subject matter, Mr. Charles Whibley suggests that it must be peculiarly painful for me to find that the ethical import of Dorian Gray has been so strongly recognized by the foremost Christian papers of England and America that I have been greeted by more than one of them as a moral reformer. Allow me, sir, to reassure on this point, not merely Mr. Charles Whibley himself, but also your no doubt anxious readers. I have no hesitation in saying that I regard such criticisms as a very gratifying tribute to my story. For if a work of art is rich and vital and complete, those who have artistic instincts will see its beauty, and those to whom ethics appeals more strongly than aesthetics will see its moral lesson. It will fill the cowardly with terror, and the unclean will see it in their own shame. It will be to each man what he is himself. It is the spectator and not life that art really mirrors. And so, in the case of Dorian Gray, the purely literary critic, as in The Speaker and elsewhere, regards it as a serious and fascinating work of art. The critic who deals with art in its relation to conduct, as the Christian leader and the Christian world, regards it as an ethical parable. Light, which I am told is the organ of the English mystics, regards it as a work of high spiritual import. The St. James Gazette, which is seeking apparently to be the organ of the prurient, sees or pretends to see in it all kinds of dreadful things, and hints at treasury prosecutions. And your Mr. Charles Whibley genially says that he discovers in it lots of morality. It is quite true that he goes on to say that he detects no art in it. But I do not think that it is fair to expect a critic to be able to see a work of art from every point of view. Even Gautier had his limitations just as much as Diderot had, and in modern England, Goethes are rare. I can only assure Mr. Charles Whibley that no moral apotheosis to which he has added the most modest contribution could possibly be a source of unhappiness to an artist. I remain, sir, your obedient servant, Oscar Wilde. To the editor of the Scots Observer, 13 August. Sir, I am afraid I cannot enter into any newspaper discussion on the subject of art with Mr. Whibley, partly because the writing of letters is always a trouble to me, and partly because I regret to say that I do not know what qualifications Mr. Whibley possesses for the discussion of so important a topic. I merely noticed his letter because, I am sure without in any way intending it, he made a suggestion about myself personally that was quite inaccurate. His suggestion was that it must have been painful to me to find that a certain section of the public, as represented by himself and the critics of some religious publications, had insisted on finding what he calls lots of morality in my story of the Picture of Dorian Gray. Being naturally desirous of setting your readers right on a question of such vital interest to the historian, I took the opportunity of pointing out in your columns that I regarded all such criticisms as a very gratifying tribute to the ethical beauty of the story, and I added that I was quite ready to recognize that it was not really fair to ask of any ordinary critic that he should be able to appreciate a work of art from every point of view. I still hold this opinion. If a man sees the artistic beauty of a thing, he will probably care very little for its ethical import. If his temperament is more susceptible to ethical than to aesthetic influences, he will be blind to the question of style, treatment, and the like. It takes a Goethe to see a work of art fully, completely, and perfectly, and I thoroughly agree with Mr. Whibley when he says that it is a pity that Goethe never had an opportunity of reading Dorian Gray. I feel quite certain that he would have been delighted by it, and I only hope that some ghostly publisher is even now distributing shadowy copies in the Elysian fields, and that the cover of Gaudier's copy is powdered with gilt asphodels. You may ask me, sir, why I should care to have the ethical beauty of my story recognized. I answer simply because it exists, because the thing is there. The chief merit of Madame Bovary is not the moral lesson that can be found in it, any more than the chief merit of Salammbô is its archaeology. But Flaubert was perfectly right in exposing the ignorance of those who called the one immoral and the other inaccurate. And not merely was he right in the ordinary sense of the word, but he was artistically right, which is everything. The critic has to educate the public. The artist has to educate the critic. Allow me to make one more correction, sir, and I will have done with Mr. Whibley. He ends his letter with the statement that I have been indefatigable in my public appreciation of my own work. I have no doubt that in saying this he means to pay me a compliment, but he really overrates my capacity as well as my inclination for work. I must frankly confess that, by nature and by choice, I am extremely indolent. Cultivated idleness seems to me to be the proper occupation for man. I dislike newspaper controversies of any kind, and of the 216 criticisms of Dorian Gray that have passed from my library table into the waste paper basket, I have taken public notice of only 3. One was that which was appeared in the Scots Observer. I noticed it because it made a suggestion about the intention of the author in writing the book, which needed correction. The second was an article in the St. James Gazette. It was offensively and vulgarly written, and seemed to me to require immediate and caustic censure. The tone of the article was an impertinence to any man of letters. The third was a meek attack in a paper called The Daily Chronicle. I think my writing to the Daily Chronicle was an act of pure willfulness. In fact, I feel sure it was. I quite forget what they said. I believe they said that Dorian Gray was poisonous, and I thought that, on alliterative grounds, it would be kind to remind them that, however that may be, it is at any rate perfect. That was all. Of the other 213 criticisms, I have taken no notice. Indeed, I have not read more than half of them. It is a sad thing, but one wearies even of praise. As regards Mr. Brown's letter, it is interesting only insofar as it exemplifies the truth of what I have said above on the question of the 2 obvious schools of critics. Mr. Brown says frankly that he considers morality to be the strong point of my story. Mr. Brown means well, and has got hold of a half-truth, but when he proceeds to deal with the book from the artistic standpoint, he of course goes sadly astray. To class Dorian Gray with M. Zola's La Terre is as silly as if one were to class Musset's Fortunio with one of the Adelphi melodramas. Mr. Brown should be content with ethical appreciation. There he is impregnable. Mr. Crobben opens badly by describing my letter setting Mr. Whibley right on a matter of fact as an impudent paradox. The term impudent is meaningless, and the word paradox is misplaced. I am afraid that writing to newspapers has a deteriorating influence on style. People get violent and abusive and lose all sense of proportion when they enter that curious journalistic arena in which the race is always to the noisiest. Impudent paradox is neither violent nor abusive, but it is not an expression that should have ever been used about my letter. However, Mr. Coben makes full atonement afterwards for what was no doubt a mere error of manner by adopting the impudent paradox in question as his own, and pointing out that, as I had previously said, the artist will always look at the work of art from the standpoint of beauty of style and beauty of treatment, and that those who have got the sense of beauty, or whose sense of beauty is dominated by ethical considerations, will always turn their attention to the subject matter and make its moral import the test and touchstone of the poem, or novel, or picture that is presented to them, while the newspaper critic will sometimes take one side and sometimes the other, according as he is cultured or uncultured. In fact, Mr. Coben converts the impudent paradox into a tedious truism, and I dare say in doing so does good service. The English public like tediousness, and like things to be explained to them in a tedious way. Mr. Coben has, I have no doubt, already repented of the unfortunate expression with which he has made his debut, so I will say no more about it. As far as I am concerned, he is quite forgiven. And finally, sir, in taking leave of the Scots Observer, I feel bound to make a candid confession to you. It has been suggested to me by a great friend of mine, who is a charming and distinguished man of letters, and not unknown to you personally, that there have been really only two people engaged in this terrible controversy, and that those two people are the editor of the Scots Observer and the author of Dorian Gray. At dinner this evening, over some excellent Chianti, my friend insisted that under assumed and mysterious names you had simply given dramatic expression to the views of some of the semi-educated classes in our community, and that the letters signed H were your own skillful, if somewhat bitter, caricature of the Philistine as drawn by himself. I admit that something of the kind had occurred to me when I read H's first letter, the one in which he proposed that the test of art should be the political opinions of the artist, and that if one differed from the artist on the question of the best way of misgoverning Ireland, one should always abuse his work. Still, there are such infinite varieties of Philistines, and North Britain is so renowned for seriousness, that I dismiss the idea as unworthy of the editor of a Scotch paper. I now fear that I was wrong, and that you have been amusing yourself all the time by inventing little puppets, and teaching them how to use big words. Well, sir, if it be so, and my friend is strong upon the point, allow me to congratulate you most sincerely on the cleverness with which you have reproduced that lack of literary style which is, I am told, essential for any dramatic and lifelike characterization. I confess that I was completely taken in, but I bear no malice, and as you have no doubt been laughing at me in your sleeve, let me now join openly in the laugh, though it be a little against myself. A comedy ends when the secret is out. Drop your curtain and put your dolls to bed. I love Don Quixote, but I do not wish to fight any longer with marionettes, however cunning may be the master hand that works their wires. Let them go, sir, on the shelf. The shelf is the proper place for them. On some future occasion you can relabel them and bring them out for our amusement. They are an excellent company and go well through their tricks, and if they are a little unreal, I am not the one to object to unreality in art. The jest was really a good one. The only thing that I cannot understand is why you gave your marionettes such extraordinary and improbable names. I remain, sir, your obedient servant, Oscar Wilde. Preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray. The artist is the creator of beautiful things. To reveal art and conceal the artist is art's aim. The critic is he who can translate into another manner or a new material his impression of beautiful things. The highest as the lowest form of criticism is a mode of autobiography. Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. This is a fault. Those who find beautiful meanings in beautiful things are the cultivated. For these there is hope. They are the elect to whom beautiful things mean only beauty. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. The 19th century dislike of realism is the rage of Caliban seeing his own face in a glass. The 19th century dislike of romanticism is the rage of Caliban not seeing his own face in a glass. The moral life of man forms part of the subject matter of the artist, but the morality of art consists in the perfect use of an imperfect medium. No artist desires to prove anything. Even things that are true can be proved. No artist has ethical sympathies. An ethical sympathy in an artist is an unpardonable mannerism of style. No artist is ever morbid. The artist can express everything. Thought and language are to the artist instruments of an art. Vice and virtue are to the artist materials for an art. From the point of view of form, the type of all the arts is the art of the musician. From the point of view of feeling, the actor's craft is the type. All art is at once surface and symbol. Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril. Those who read the symbol do so at their peril. It is the spectator, and not life, that art really mirrors. Diversity of opinion about a work of art shows that the work is new, complex, and vital. When critics disagree, the artist is in accord with himself. We can forgive a man for making a useful thing as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that one admires it intensely. All art is quite useless. This is the end of In Defense of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Thank you for listening.